Hey everyone, this is Ramzi. I'm a ClickUp verified consultant and I help teams set up ClickUp through my agency. Now, if you're new to ClickUp and looking for a walkthrough on the basics, you're in the right place. In this step-by-step tutorial, I'll explain you how to sign up to ClickUp and set up your personal and workspace settings. We'll do a quick tour of the ClickUp interface and I'll show you how to create your first space, folder, list, and task in ClickUp. This video is perfect if you're a beginner and you're just starting with ClickUp. But if you want to go further, you can get access to your free ClickUp mini course in the description below. Now let's get started. The first thing we want to do is to create our ClickUp workspace. We're going to go to the ClickUp homepage and click sign up here on top or get started. Enter our email, click next, and then it's going to ask us to put our full name and pick a password. I'll click play with ClickUp, and ClickUp is going to send me an email just to confirm my email address. So the first thing is to go through the classic onboarding. We're going to say we're a company and we're using ClickUp for work, and we're going to be around 26 to 250 people, but only 26 to 50 are going to work on ClickUp. I work in a creative and design team, and then it's going to ask you a few questions that you can actually skip. You could put your phone number if you want to. That's quite important if you want to use two-factor authentications. Get a text each time you log in for extra security. And then we're going to skip that and skip the invite people to our workspace because we don't want to do that yet. We want to make sure our workspace is well set up before inviting our first coworkers. I'm going to say I'm done and I'm going to name my workspace. I'm going to pick a name called Hero, assuming my company has that name, and ClickUp is going to create our workspace for us. This only takes a few seconds and it brings you to an onboarding video that you can actually skip. And also an onboarding here on the bottom left that you can skip as well, because I'm going to explain you everything in this video, so you don't really need to go through that. All right, so ClickUp has created by default a space called Team Space, but we can delete that one and start fresh. I'm going to right click on it and click delete. And here I'm going to enter the space name, Team Space. Let's start from the beginning. What we're going to do is go to our settings. We're going to click here on the top right and go to settings. And we are going to start with personal settings. Personal settings are settings that only apply to you, meaning your coworkers will set their own personal settings and it won't affect yours. Here, what you can set up is the basic info, like your full name, an avatar, a password, the type of authentication you want. And what I'm just going to change is the avatars. I'm going to click here, add custom avatar, and I'm going to pick a nice photo of me. And once we're good to go, we're going to save our changes. That means that this image will appear on any task that's assigned to me, or when I collaborate with someone. I recommend everyone to add their own avatar so that it makes it up a little bit more human and you can actually see someone's nice photo. Moving on to color, we can actually pick another color and save. And if I want to use purple, as you can see, everything in ClickUp will appear in purple to me. Then the language and region setting. By default, ClickUp will use American language region settings, but if you're somewhere else in the world, you can actually choose to have your start of calendar on Monday or time format on 24 hours or use day month here. And this will only affect you, which means if you're working, say in London and you're on the London time zone and you want to use European style calendar, and someone else is working in the US, they can use their own US style calendar. This is only going to be personal to them and to you. Moving on to the preferences, I recommend you to keep it as it is. This is a little bit more advanced and by default, it's very good as it is. Now, ClickUp notifications is a pretty huge topic and we'll cover it fully in another video. But when you start off, I recommend you to take some time, at least a few minutes, to set up your notifications. Because the biggest frustration I see with ClickUp is people receiving too many notifications. So you can reduce the amount of notifications and actually receive notifications that you need by doing a few changes here. The first change we're going to do is only keep a single channel for notifications. By default, ClickUp turns on all notification channels, but you really only need one or two. The ClickUp inbox is where you're going to receive most of your task information, and it's just notifications that are going to appear in your workspace. Keep that on. and only keep another channel like emails, for example. In 99% of cases, people want to receive emails for when something happens in ClickUp. I'll turn off mobile and browser. And there we go. I've only kept email and inbox for most of my notifications. Now, the next step is going to decide when I am actually notified. What triggers my notifications? Here on top, as you can see, you could be notified as soon as an event happens on a task. What we're going to keep is only the when I comment on a task or subtask here. And we're going to turn off the others because we don't really want to receive notifications when we create a task or edit a task. It could be that we're a manager and we create a lot of tasks for our team and we don't want to be bombarded with 100 notifications each task we created. I recommend to actually use the ClickUp collaboration features, meaning comments in ClickUp, and only be notified when you actually comment on something and you're waiting for a reply. Now, about when to be notified. And that's an important point because you don't really want to be notified the second someone's mentioned something, because you could be working on the task and actually answer to it without receiving the notification. What we're going to do is tick this smart notifications box and decide that ClickUp waits at least for a few hours before it notifies us. I like to choose 3 or 6 hours, which is more or less half a day of work. And that means if we reply by the 3 hours, for example, we won't be notified and it will keep our inbox a bit cleaner. These are the few basics for notifications, but you can go much further by ticking on and off a few of them and just invest the time in setting up the right notification settings. Now, moving on to the cloud storage personal settings, you want to keep enabled the cloud storage that you actually use. I personally use Google Drive, so I will turn off the others, which means that each time I attach something to a task in ClickUp, it will offer me to attach it through Google Drive, but it won't display the other cloud storage that I don't really need. Finally, the last personal notification settings that could be useful is the calendar. You could actually sync your Google Calendar or Outlook calendar with ClickUp back and forth. You could receive your events in ClickUp from your calendar, and you could also display your ClickUp tasks into your Google Calendar, for example. And you can do that right from here through adding a Google account or an Outlook account. We're going to move on to the most important part of settings, which are the workspace settings. And this is very important and very sensitive because whichever changes that you're going to do from now on are going to apply to everyone in your company. We're going to start off with the basic workspace settings, which is the workspace name and workspace logo. Here we're going to pick a nice logo. There we go. I've uploaded a logo and now everyone will see our nice company logo here. Now, another thing you can do with the basic workspace settings is turn on the personal workspace layout. What that means is that it will remove all of the collaboration features from ClickUp, and it's mostly useful if you are working alone on ClickUp and if you don't need to collaborate with other people, other teammates. If you're a freelancer, if you're a solopreneur, you might need to turn on the personal workspace layout to make the ClickUp workspace a little bit cleaner. The next thing that's very crucial for your workspace is going to be to pick a plan. And we will talk about ClickUp plans and compare them in another video. But just so you know, ClickUp has 4 plans and you can actually upgrade to the 3 first plans straight from here. And we offer a 20% discount that you can find in the description below to start with a paid plan on ClickUp at a cheaper price. Make sure you use our discount and pick the right plan for you and your team. Let's assume you've picked the right ClickUp plan. A few settings in the security and permissions are going to turn on here. If you're in the business plan, you can do pretty much everything with security and permission, but on the enterprise plan, you're completely safe and you can actually abide by very strict security company policies. And depending on your need, you might want to go for the business or enterprise plan if security is important for you. Here, what you can do is set up the 2-factor authentication, set up SSO, session management, and actually set up your roles and permissions for your company. If you're on the enterprise plan, you could even create another role that has, say, more or less rights than your member, and even fine-tune further your roles and permissions. Now, a few extra things that you can do with the enterprise plan are appearing here below, and you can actually turn on and off these settings if you are on the enterprise plan. If you set up your personal settings, as well as the company basic settings, security and permissions, you're pretty much good to go with ClickUp. All of the other things that appear here on the left, you might want to change them, but probably as you go and as you start using the tool. You could decide to invite people straight from this panel here and actually bring in members or guests, and we'll talk about it further. What I recommend is not to invite anyone for now and invite them from the hierarchy, which we'll talk about later. Next, you can decide to turn on and off some ClickApps for your ClickUp workspace. ClickApps are features of ClickUp that you can decide to turn on and off for your whole workspace. I recommend you to read a little bit more about each ClickUp to understand what it does and decide to enable it or not. But in most cases, when you start with ClickUp, you don't want to change that. And you could even want to remove some ClickUps that you don't need. An example could be removing the lineup ClickUp that's not necessarily useful, or the GIF ClickUp, or remove Office 365 if you use another cloud storage option. And you want to have a look at that and turn off the ClickUps that you don't really need. You don't want to start with an overwhelming, complex workspace and just keep it simple in the beginning and turn on the ClickUps that you need a little bit later. Now, another thing you can decide to turn on in ClickUp is integrations with other softwares. If you go on the left to integrations, you can see that there are quite a lot of softwares that you can connect with ClickUp, such as Dropbox, Figma, GitHub, etc. Same here. What you want to do is start setting up ClickUp for your team and then think about how you can integrate ClickUp with other software. Next, you can set up your ClickUp teams. ClickUp teams are groups of members that are invited to ClickUp. And what you can do with that is create a whole team for, say, marketing, for example, and assign a task to only marketing and not someone specifically if you don't really know who has to do it. The team feature is pretty useful if you have a few departments working on ClickUp and one department needs to assign it to another without knowing into detail who will operate and execute that task. Now you can add a few other things. Task type came pretty recently on ClickUp. You could also decide to import your tasks from another app if you are just moving to ClickUp, but we'll talk about that in another video. You could decide to connect ClickUp through API, integrate your emails into ClickUp, look at your trash, but all of these features are pretty much things that you might use as ClickUp lives and not in the beginning, so you don't have to worry about it. Let's assume you've set up your personal settings, you've set up your company settings, you're good to start working on ClickUp. And the ClickUp UI is pretty simple and straightforward if you are just starting blank. Here on the top, you will have the toolbar, and the toolbar is a central place to access pretty much every feature of ClickUp. We can start with the search bar, and you can just click here on top or do Command K or Control K, and this will let you search anything in ClickUp or even in a software that's connected to it. You could imagine connecting your Google Drive to ClickUp and searching for a Google Docs straight from here. This really makes ClickUp a central hub for your team, for your workspace. And I find myself using the search bar pretty much 99% of the time when I'm searching for a task or a document. This is going to come very handy for you. Next, there's ClickUp AI, but that's a whole nother topic, so we'll talk about it in another video. And here on the right side, you can actually create a new task, open your tasks, open your notepad, record a clip if you want to record your screen and share something on a task, for example, create reminders, access your documents, or do a few other things. We won't dive into that, but just so you know, the toolbar is pretty much where all of the ClickUp features are centralized. And I found myself using it more and more. If I want to access automations or templates, for example, I don't need to think about where it is. I know it's here on top in the toolbar. Next, we have the sidebar, which is our vertical area here. It's a side panel that centralizes both our main areas of ClickUp, which are the home, the docs, the dashboards, ClickUp Pulse, the whiteboards. We won't go further into that either. but just so you know, this is a central place for the main parts of ClickUp. And here we have our hierarchy below, and that's quite a core part of ClickUp, and I'll explain you what the hierarchy looks like. What we want to do is create our first task in ClickUp. We're going to assume for this company called Hero, our marketing department will follow up on social media tasks and let's say SEO tasks here in ClickUp. What we want to do is create a space that represents this department. Think of spaces as big chunks, big components of your company. Very often it's departments, but it could also be large projects. The way you split your company into different spaces in ClickUp really depends on the way you work. You might need a dedicated consultation or doing a self-assessment to try to understand what's the best way to split my company across spaces in my workspace in ClickUp. But here we're going to start off pretty simple with one department called marketing. We're going to go into a new space here on the plus and say we call it marketing. Move on to next. We can put a description. I'm not going to do that. Pretty explicit. This is a space for the marketing department. And then you can pick a color and an avatar. I'm just going to put something very quickly, let's say green and a chart. Move on to next. And then it's going to ask me if I want to make this space public or private. Now, in 99% of the cases, you want to keep your spaces public because you're collaborating with people. A space by design is going to be a place where you're going to work back and forth with people. You don't really need to create a private space in ClickUp. What you can do instead is create a private list, and we'll show you what lists are later. Here we're going to create a public space. Move on to next. And we are going to pick a workflow that fits with the way our team works. I'm going to keep a very simple workflow to do complete. What I recommend is to start with something simple again and refine your statuses as you understand your company's workflow and you've assessed it, because most of these default statuses don't really apply to real life use cases and to your real company workflow. Make sure you tailor your statuses to how your company works. Let's start with to do and complete. Move on to next. And we land on the space ClickApps. Now we've talked about ClickApps a bit earlier, but these were workspace ClickApps. So ClickApps that we can use at company level, at workspace levels. ClickUp lets you enable and disable features also at space levels. Everything that you turn on and off here will only apply to the marketing space. Say the marketing space needs to work with custom fields, we'll keep it on. But if we turn off custom fields and decide to use custom fields in another space, we can also do that. The same way, if we want to enable sprints, for example, because we work in Agile in this team and not in another, we could decide to turn on sprints in this space and turn it off in another. We're going to keep a few on and we'll talk about ClickApps further in another video. Now I'm going to click next and I'm going to select my views. We want to really dive into views, but again, in the same philosophy of keeping it simple, I'm going to keep only the list view. And just so you know, if you only keep the list view, you can actually turn on the other views later. I recommend you to keep only one default view and turn on the other views later as you need. ClickUp is going to ask us if we are happy with our setup. We can just say yes and click create space. What happens here is that ClickUp will create a space called marketing as we wanted, but also a list. A list is going to be the place where our tasks live, where our tasks are stored. But before we dive into this, we are going to create an intermediate level to group our list together. And that's what ClickUp calls a folder. We're going to go here on the plus and click folder and name our folder according to maybe a project or a larger topic that we might need to group different lists together. This really requires a little bit of conceptualization of ClickUp and understanding how your department works of ClickUp before setting it up here. And that's something we provide for our clients. But if you are confident with the way your team is structured, for example, you could decide, say, in my marketing department, there is a team working on social media. And in social media, there are a few things to manage. which are LinkedIn, Instagram, and other social media platforms. What I'm going to do here is create a folder called social media, and in there, I'm going to nest some lists. ClickUp created another list by default, and I'm going to rename it to LinkedIn. What I'm going to do is also create another one. I'm going to click the plus here and list and call it Instagram. And here we have a structure, a hierarchy that starts to make sense. We have our marketing department that works on social media, and in social media, you have to manage different platforms, one being LinkedIn and the other Instagram. But we also work on SEO on our marketing department, work on blogging. What we're going to do is create a list to handle our blog post project. And we're going to use the one that ClickUp created by default and rename it and call it blog. And as you can see here, you could actually have a list nested into a folder, but also at space level. You don't necessarily have to use folders. And I actually recommend clients to start simple without using folders. In a lot of cases, I was able to set up workspaces with only spaces and lists and avoiding folders, because the more you complexify your hierarchy and your structure here, the harder the navigation becomes and the more frustrations it will create for your team, and the harder it is to manage team onboarding and training on ClickUp. I've seen workspaces where it's hundreds of lists nested into folders and it starts to become a mess, and everyone finds ClickUp very hard to understand and very overwhelming. But that's really because the setup was made complex. Try to keep it simple. And here we have our 3 lists folder, and we are pretty much done with building up our marketing department. A very important thing to understand with ClickUp is that it works in terms of inheritance. Whichever change you do into a space settings will apply to the folder and list. The same way, if you fine-tune custom fields or statuses into this folder social media, it will apply into what's below, LinkedIn and Instagram. But it won't apply into this list that's apart, and that's called blog. It's important for you to understand that, because you really want to set things up at the right level, which means the highest level possible that doesn't clutter other workspaces. For the sake of this example, we're going to go at folder level, and we are going to create a custom field that applies to scheduling content on social media like LinkedIn and Instagram. We don't want to create that at the level called LinkedIn here, because we also want to use that in the list called Instagram. Let's do it at this folder level called social media. And you don't really have to remember how to create a column or how to create a custom field right now. This is just to make you understand a little bit about the hierarchy, but we'll dive a little bit deeper into all the custom fields that you can use. For now, I'm going to create it, and you're just going to have to follow up with how I do. I'm going to create a custom field called publishing, and it's going to be a date field type, and we're going to add this column. So what happens here is that this publishing column appears in the LinkedIn list, but also in the Instagram list. As you can see, the changes will affect all the levels below wherever I set up something in ClickUp. This hierarchy aspect is quite important to understand and quite core to how ClickUp works, because in a lot of cases, I see people setting up a custom field in one list and another one in another list, and these custom fields actually are used for the same thing. So you end up having duplicates. We're starting to get into a little bit more advanced features and a little bit more details there. What we'll do here is just keep it simple by finishing up this tutorial by teaching you how to create your first task in ClickUp. We went to this list called blog, and what we're going to do is create our first task that's going to be a blog post to create in the future. I'm going to call my task blog post how to use ClickUp in 2024. This is the title of my blog post. It's the task to do, and I am going to be the manager of that task. I'm going to assign myself to that task here on the assignee column. What that means is that now we know what task to do, who does it, but what we need to also put is when does it have to be done, and that's the due date. The due date is going to determine when the task has to be closed. Some last item we could set up is also the priorities. How important is this task, this blog post to do? And we're going to pick a priority such as high, for example. We could decide to display other columns to tailor a few other things, such as when the task has to start, is there documents attached, is there other tasks linked, but we won't dive into that as this starts to become more advanced. Now we have a very basic task with a name, an assignee, a due date, and a priority. And all of these settings, especially the assignee and due date, they're quite essential to using ClickUp. And I find a lot of people start creating tasks, but don't actually assign them or set up priorities or give them a deadline. And you end up with a big bunch of tasks, but they're not really laid out so that someone knows what they have to work on. Now that we've set up our task, the last thing on the display is how you can actually nest one task into another. Say for this blog post, we have to do some research and some writing. There are 2 subtasks that have to be done to complete this blog post. And what we're going to do is create this subtask. We're going to click here on the plus on the right of the task name, add our subtask, and the first one is going to be called research. The second one is going to be called writing. As you can see, ClickUp has created subtasks at a below level. And just so you know, you could create subtasks up to 7 levels below. What I recommend you is to keep it as it is in the beginning, or maybe go to the ClickUps and turn on up to 3 levels of subtask maximum. But if you start going further, this really becomes a mess. What you want to do here is also refine the information of these subtasks. You want to add an assignee, a due date, a priority to these tasks. And what I'm going to do is actually invite my first member to my ClickUp workspace, because I'm not going to be the one doing the research or the writing. It's going to be someone called Nina. What I'm going to do is go into the left sidebar and right click on blog, go into sharing and permissions, and invite my coworker. My coworker is Nina@hero.com. This person is going to be invited to my workspace, and from there, I can actually assign them on the task. I'm going to invite them. And as you can see, they now appear in my marketing space and they have access to this list. Now that I've done that, I can actually select them here from the assignee panel and say, Nina, you have to do that. And Nina will be notified that they have to work on the research and writing for that blog post. Because the blog post has to be done by Thursday, I'll actually put the research to be done by Tuesday and the writing to be done by Wednesday. Now we have a task with subtasks and due dates. And we are done with the very basics on how to set up your ClickUp workspace and create your first task. Now, if we open up that task, we're opening up a whole nother realm that we'll talk about in another video on how to actually manage that task and the main features that you have to know about when you're starting and beginning with ClickUp. But this will be for another time. Thank you for watching. There you have it. We've covered everything to get started with ClickUp. Now, if you want to dive deeper into ClickUp and make the most of it, you can watch my video on 10 features you should know about as a beginner in ClickUp, or download your guide in the description below. Let me know if you have any other questions on getting up and running with ClickUp in the comments. I'll see you next time. Stay productive.